About 55% of Indian exports to the U.S. are expected to take a hit from tariffs imposed by the Trump administration.
As expected, the White House has announced an increase on duties to Canadian softwood lumber.
But a lot of companies have signaled that price hikes aren't. How might this all look in a real person's life?
From the diamond on a finger to the wooden frame of a home, American consumers are paying the price for President Donald Trump's tariff politics. Since August 1st, his administration has pushed ahead with aggressive new trade measures, and they're hitting both luxury goods and everyday essentials. Two flashpoints stand out: a 50% tariff on Indian goods, including most of the diamonds entering the U.S., and a series of steep duties on Canadian exports, including softwood lumber, now taxed at over 35%. The White House frames these moves as leverage, a way to draw better deals for America. But the cost is landing in the laps of U.S. households, from engagement rings to new housing construction.
Right now, 90% of diamonds are manufactured in India, so cut and polished in India. That's not going to change in the near term. So a lot of this price increase will get passed on to the U.S. consumer.
India is the beating heart of the global diamond trade. Around 90% of the world's diamonds are cut and polished there, according to the Gem and Jewelry Export Promotion Council. In early August, the U.S. raised tariffs on Indian goods from 25% to 50%, citing India's continued purchases of Russian oil. In New York's Diamond District, the impact was immediate. Jewelers can't absorb that kind of cost. When the duty was at 10%, the industry could share the hit between suppliers and customers. At 50%, the math no longer works. Retail prices are expected to rise sharply heading into the holiday season, a time when jewelry sales normally peak. This comes on top of another factor. Gold prices are already at record highs, roughly double what they were just a few years ago. Together, these forces are pushing engagement rings and other fine jewelry further out of reach for many Americans. Some buyers are even considering traveling overseas to make purchases where tariffs don't apply. But that option is hardly realistic for most. The result is a squeeze on an industry that was already undergoing change, as lab-grown diamonds take a larger share of the market. The same kind of cost pressure is now emerging in America's trade with Canada. The clearest example is in softwood lumber. This month, Washington doubled certain duties, bringing the total rate on Canadian softwood to 35.19%.
Tariffs have added $6,000 to the cost of building a single-family home in the United States.
This is also going to make it next to impossible for Americans, middle-class Americans, to build their home.
That's not just a number on paper. The Ontario Forest Industries Association cites research showing it adds about $6,000 to the cost of building a single-family home in the United States. Canadian officials point out that these costs will fall hardest on middle-class families and on Americans rebuilding after disasters like wildfires and hurricanes. Ottawa isn't sitting idle, though. Just days before the U.S. announcement, Prime Minister Mark Carney's government unveiled a $1.2 billion Canadian dollar support package for the industry, including $700 million Canadian dollars in loan guarantees to keep mills running and $500 million Canadian dollars to diversify markets and develop new products. From diamonds to lumber, Trump's tariffs are reshaping the American marketplace, making luxury items harder to afford and driving up the cost of everyday necessities. The Yale Budget Lab projects the 2025 tariff package could add thousands of dollars to the average household's annual expenses, tightening budgets nationwide. While Trump wields tariffs as a negotiation tool, Canada under Prime Minister Mark Carney is taking a steadier path, reinforcing its industries, keeping retaliation measured, and diversifying toward markets in Europe and Asia. The real test is whether these tariff politics will deliver lasting gains for the U.S. or simply leave Americans paying more while Canada holds its ground.
President Trump's sweeping global tariffs for more than 90 countries have come into effect.
From a blanket minimum of 10% up to a high of 50%, with some hefty levies on some of the United States' major trading partners.
Let's control what we can control. Not what Donald Trump dictates, but what we can control.
On August 7th, U.S. Customs and Border Protection began collecting a sweeping new round of import tariffs signed by President Donald Trump. Rates now range from 10 to 50% on more than 60 countries. Brazil faces 50%. Switzerland is at 39%. Laos and Myanmar are at 40%. The European Union, Japan, and South Korea have 15% rates under new agreements, and the United Kingdom pays 10% after its own deal. Trump also announced a potential 100% tariff on foreign-made computer chips, with exemptions for companies building in the United States. Apple pledged a $100 billion investment, but the chip tariff is not yet formalized.
And what it means is, for America, their US levies on tariffs are now at the highest level for centuries. The president put out that post on social media saying billions of dollars in tariffs are now flowing into the United States of America.
Today, and according to a research center at Yale, the new tariffs could cost an average American family an extra $2,400 a year.
By July, the U.S. government had already collected over $150 billion from existing tariffs. Economists stress these costs fall on U.S. importers, often passed to consumers. June's Consumer Price Index showed prices rising for appliances, clothing, and furniture. Beyond North America, the same tariff logic is hitting other exporters. India faces a jump from 25% to a threatened 50% over Russian oil purchases, while South Africa warns of job losses as U.S. tariffs erode past advantages and push them to hunt thinner margin markets in the Middle East, Asia, and Africa. The takeaway for Ottawa is simple. Countries are racing to reroute exports, so Canada's own diversification, already visible with Ontario grain shifting to Europe, has to move fast and stay disciplined.
Here in Canada, officials are already talking about the impact of tariffs because President Trump hit Canada with an increase of 35% tariffs last Friday.
Canada has been under these new pressures since August 1st, when Trump's administration raised tariffs on non-USMCA goods to 35%. Over 85% of bilateral trade remains tariff-free, but targeted sectors are feeling the pinch. Softwood lumber already faces heavy U.S. duties. Steel, aluminum, and certain manufactured goods now face added barriers. Some exporters are adjusting quickly. Ontario is both a major grain producer and a major grain buyer. The province imports large volumes of certain U.S. grains, making it the #1 customer for farmers in 35 to 40 American states, while also exporting Canadian-grown grain abroad. Now, with Trump's 35% tariff on non-USMCA goods, some of Ontario's own export shipments are being diverted away from the U.S. market and into Europe. That shift may help Canada diversify, but it also means U.S. grain farmers could lose one of their largest and most reliable customers if cross-border buying slows.
The Prime Minister was tight-lipped a day after saying he'd consider removing some counter tariffs on American goods if it would help Canadian industries.
Prime Minister Mark Carney met in Ottawa with his cabinet and premiers to align the national approach. His message: keep talks with Washington open, avoid bad deals, and shield domestic industries from immediate harm. He has suggested removing some Canadian counter tariffs if it benefits key sectors. Provincial leaders differ. Ontario's Doug Ford supports tariff-for-tariff measures and warns against trusting Trump. Saskatchewan's Scott Moe wants to reduce or drop counter tariffs to lower domestic costs. Trade experts recommend keeping retaliation as a bargaining tool without escalating unnecessarily. Canada is also leaning on major industrial projects. Volkswagen's $7 billion Canadian PowerCo battery plant in St. Thomas is moving forward despite uncertainty, while procurement in other areas is strained. The Amherstburg fire chief cites delays and higher costs for a $3.1 million US-made fire truck with a 3-year build time due to tariffs and supply shortages. The coming weeks will reveal whether Trump formalizes the 100% chip tariff and how exemptions are defined. Canada may adjust counter tariffs to protect vulnerable sectors while maintaining leverage. In the US, early price increases could spread, adding pressure to import-reliant industries. Trump's tariffs are both an economic weapon and a political signal. For Carney, the challenge is to protect Canada's economy while keeping options open. The choices made now will decide whether this standoff deepens or shifts toward a fragile new balance.
Lula da Silva that Brazil will respond in kind with its own tariffs if the U.S. goes through what it wants to do by August 1. Your thoughts?
President Donald Trump's second-term trade doctrine has entered a volatile phase. In recent weeks, the administration has issued formal notices to a string of trade partners. 35% tariffs on Canada, 30% on Mexico, 50% on Brazil. These aren't just economic decisions. They are calculated power plays, and the world is responding. Rather than strengthening American leverage, Trump's tariff blitz is hardening resistance. Countries that once depended on U.S. trade are now coordinating responses, and in some cases, turning away altogether.
We both agree that it is essential to respect the USMCA trade agreements, and we shared our experiences about the letter we received from President Trump.
One of the clearest signs that Trump's pressure is backfiring came this week, when Canada and Mexico publicly pledged to strengthen bilateral trade. Both countries confirmed they had received tariff letters from the U.S., 35% for Canada, 30% for Mexico, set to take effect August 1st if negotiations fail. In response, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney and Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum agreed to deepen economic cooperation. Carney is expected to visit Mexico in the coming weeks to formalize joint strategies. For two neighbors long tied to the U.S. through the USMCA, this pivot marks a significant realignment. Rather than fracture, Trump's tariff threats are pushing America's closest allies to close ranks, without the U.S.
Consider that maybe for the last 50 years, we are going through the worst moment in the relation between Brazil and Washington.
Tensions are even sharper further south. Brazil was hit with the steepest tariff, 50% on all exports to the U.S., up from 10% announced in April. Trump framed the move as retaliation for what he called political persecution of former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro, who faces charges for his role in the January 2023 coup attempt. Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva rejected the move as an act of political interference. His administration immediately activated a new fast response tariff mechanism, authorizing counter tariffs against U.S. goods. According to Brazil's Ministry of Development, only 12% of Brazilian exports are destined for the U.S., allowing the country to redirect trade with minimal disruption. The sectors affected include oil, orange juice, coffee, and steel. While the economic exposure is manageable, the diplomatic damage is real. Lula has publicly signaled a shift toward deeper ties with BRICS nations and Asian partners, a trend accelerated by Trump's moves.
This is unilateralism, and it's highly personalistic. It's President Trump because he doesn't like somebody. And, and I think it has very severe implications for U.S. relations with Latin America.
The ripple effects go beyond Brazil. In Colombia, relations have deteriorated rapidly after allegations emerged linking U.S. figures to an attempted political plot. Trump responded by recalling the U.S. ambassador and threatening to revoke Colombia's drug cooperation certification, a move that could cut vital aid. But instead of backing down, President Gustavo Petro has pushed back. His administration is now exploring deeper ties with BRICS institutions, including development financing outside the U.S. orbit. Across Latin America, a quiet realignment is underway. Countries are looking to diversify trade, reduce political exposure, and limit dependency on Washington. Trump's aggressive stance may be aimed at asserting dominance, but the region's reaction suggests it's having the opposite effect.
I mean, is it a political failure for the Prime Minister if Canada ends up with some level of tariffs at the end of this, or is it just the reality of dealing with Donald Trump?
What began as a strategy to strengthen U.S. leverage is now showing signs of unraveling. Rather than forcing deals on America's terms, the tariff campaign is driving partners together and away from Washington's orbit. Canada is no longer negotiating alone. Mexico is no longer avoiding alignment. Brazil, once neutral, is openly confronting U.S. influence. And in Europe, even close allies are preparing for long-term trade diversification. For the Trump administration, the short-term political optics may still resonate with parts of the domestic base. But the long-term cost is rising: fractured trust, declining diplomatic capital, and global supply chains that are learning to work around, not through, the United States. The real impact of these tariffs may not be in what they tax. It may be in what they break.